Hello, Flansfield here, and I'd like to give you a brief summary in relation to our funding applications workshop. In this summary, it's not possible to read all the slides in detail, so if you wish to read the detail on the slide, I suggest you pause the video as you go along. Before going into the summary, I'd like to say thank you to everybody that attended the workshop. It was a pleasure to work with you, and thank you very much for the kind comments that you gave in relation to the feedback and evaluation of the workshop. In terms of the funding applications, we looked at some of the current trends in relation to funding schemes. There were more complex application procedures. Sometimes there was a pre-qualification involved, and sometimes there were multiple stage applications. There's also a trend of an emphasis on greater accountability and transparency in relation to projects. Also in relation to technology, a lot of funders now use online systems, and they're looking more and more at the quality of the submissions. There's also a multiplicity of funding opportunities, and the funding is now very much targeted at specific projects. Another trend relates to outcome-based planning, and in relation to some projects, there are now dedicated staff in relation to fundraising. There are service level agreements and contracts. There's a more sophisticated evaluation system, and funders are competing with one another for results. They also now impose sometimes very tight deadlines, so it's important to be well prepared in advance so that you can meet these deadlines when the information becomes available to you. You have a number of funding options that we discussed in class, ranging from fundraising, grants, loans, membership, donations, or trading or service charges. It's important that you would match your revenue to your expenditure. For example, if your expenditure is in relation to training costs, room hire, or insurance, your revenue options there may be membership fees, service charges, or trading costs. Staff costs, light, heat, and stationery can come from program funds, again membership fees, or some of your trading fees. Equipment, buses, computers, etc. could come from county level funding, grant aid, and small scale fundraising, borrowings or donations. For capital expenditures such as premises and sports facilities, it may be a national level funding grant, and large scale fundraising, donations or borrowings. In terms of finding out who funds what, a very useful website is fundingpoint.ie, which has a database of 800 different funding schemes. So it's very useful to go on that website to see who's offering what funding. We did an exercise in class in relation to some of the difficulties that people found. In terms of funding applications, applying for funding is becoming increasingly complex and competitive. The funding arena is confusing for communities, and sometimes it operates through a language that is alien to many communities. One of the things we looked at is what causes your application to be rejected immediately. If it's a late application, if you're an ineligible group, if you fail to meet the criteria, these will be immediately rejected. If your application is incomplete or vague, some funders may return it to you to ask for more information, others may disregard it immediately. We used an example of a project that, is a good project, but the funding application for it is written in a language that really doesn't influence a fundraiser or a funder to help you. So before you apply, it's important that you identify the problem for which the funds will be sought, that you develop relationships with funders where possible, you thoroughly search for relevant grant opportunities, you consider the proposed projects fit with the identified funders, where you can consider a meeting with the funding source, but also decide if it's worth applying. In identifying the problem, you need to justify the choice of the priority problem to be addressed. You also need to look at, are there any likely negative impacts of addressing the problem or the goal? You need to frame the problem or the goal to be addressed. You need to review the naming and framing of the problem to see, does the statement of the issue focus on the condition or the outcome of interest? In identifying the problem, you need to ask questions about the problem to identify key behaviors, actors, and consequences. You then need to analyze the problem. Analyze the root causes of the problem to identify the environmental conditions and relate behaviors that might contribute to the problem or the goal. Based on the analysis, you need to identify promising interventions that might contribute to improvement. You need also to identify environmental factors that may contribute to the problem, and how do each of these factors contribute to the problem within your community. You need to identify targets and agents of change for addressing the community problem or goal. Where you can, it's important to develop a relationship with funders. Communicate with funders about your work periodically, even when you're not in the process of submitting an application. This might help you to learn about future funding prospects as well as increase your chances for a successful proposal. You should thoroughly search for the relevant grant opportunities and consider the different types of funding, be they government agencies, EU funding, private foundations, or corporate foundations. In doing this, you need to consider the proposed project's fit with the identified funders. Identify the funders' philosophy, program interests, and criteria. Do they make grants that meet your needs? Check restrictions such as geographic preferences, priority issues, or the types of organizations that can apply, and make sure that you meet their requirements. Check to see if there's an organizational fit between your group's project's mission and that of the funder. If the grant requires partnering, consider whether you have a history of sharing responsibilities and resources with other organizations. If you decide to pursue the funding opportunity, review the literature to find out what approaches might work in your situation. Learn about the problems and goals of the community and work with partners to develop an intervention for addressing them with the proposed funding. Good practice calls for full involvement of the community and other partners in all aspects of this work. In writing the application, you need to keep the application short. Some applications have a specific word count with which you should adhere to. You also need to give funders what they want. If they have set out a process for the application, make sure you follow it and provide every piece of information that they ask for. Tell the funder who you are. Offer enough information for somebody to completely new to the issue when you're describing the problem and your solution, and make sure that you address the key issues in relation to the problem. It's really important here to be able to show evidence of the need that you're suggesting. Funders like to give money for something tangible and new, and they're very reluctant to fund vague administration costs. So even if you're considering continuing with existing work, try to present it as a specific project and put it in a time frame. Be positive in your application. Try to use positive language. Offer a human story and avoid jargon where possible, unless the funder has used jargon themselves. If they do, make sure that you use the same terms that they have used. Due to the current trend towards outcome-based planning and the emphasis on impacts, it's useful to have a look at some of the terms which are commonly used, because people sometimes have difficulty in interpreting some of these terms. Some funders will offer an explanation of what they require for each term, but others do not, and they assume that the applicant is familiar with the terminology. Firstly, we'll look at inputs and outputs. Inputs relate to what you will put into your project. These can include facilities, staff and volunteer time, resources, and the time involved in carrying out the task. Outputs, on the other hand, relate to what your project produces. It could be a new program or an activity, or a physical resource such as a web page or a building. It's what's physically there as a result of your actions. Many funders now want information in relation to outcomes and impacts. Outcomes relate to what will happen as a result of your output. For example, if your output is a sports hall, what happens as a result is that young people will have a place to meet, take part in sports where they will develop a sense of teamwork. Impacts relate to what changes will occur in the wider society as a result of your project's outcomes. For example, the impact here would be that as young people develop a sense of belonging, they are less likely to become involved in antisocial behaviour, resulting in a safer and more inclusive society. We then did an exercise on upthinking, where we took a problem statement like vandalism in a community, asked ourselves the question, what do we want instead? The answer being young people involved in sport. What's your plan of action to provide a sports facility? What have you to offer? Staff, funds and equipment. We then to look at some of the jargon that's been used. So the inputs were 3 leaders, goalposts and nets, and a field from the local council. What will having that do for us? The initial outcome is that young people will have a place to meet and take part in sports. What will having that do? The higher outcome is that young people develop teamwork skills. What will having that do for us? The impact will be that young people develop a sense of belonging. They are less likely to become involved in antisocial behaviour, resulting in a safer and more inclusive society. It's a very useful kind of exercise when you have a problem statement to upthink it in this form, so you will see what your inputs, outcomes and outputs are. It's very important that you offer evidence for your cause and support any claims you make with evidence. For example, it could be from government statistics, data that you've collected from surveys or market research, or extracts from reports by relevant agencies. In asking for money, it's very important that you ask for a specific lump sum or an amount over a period of time. You need to include a basic budget unless you're asked for more detail, explaining the cost of the individual parts of the project. In providing a budget, it should explain how the money will be spent on the project. You need to check your application again and again. Sometimes it's very good to get someone outside the project team to read your application before you can send it. They can look for errors or inconsistencies and ask for explanations. First impressions count, and if you have errors in your application, you will create a bad impression. In class, we gave people a handout in relation to writing examples that were provided from an Australian and New Zealand training company. It's not possible to include them here because of copyright purposes, but they are available for people on the handouts for those.